Hello friends, welcome to Creator-Based Software Training Center. Let us discuss about default exception handling. The default exception handling, to understand this, we need to understand these 8 steps I have written. So let us follow step by step. Later I will explain with a neat diagram how it undergoes during the exception handling process. Coming to the first point, inside a method, if any exception occurs, the method in which it is raised is responsible to create exception object by including the following information: name of the exception, description of the exception, location at which the exception occurs. Any exception, wherever it occurs, it will be occurring somewhere in the method, right? So that particular method will be responsible for creating the exception object. So that exception object will be including the following information: the name of the exception, description of the exception, location at which the exception occurs. Okay. After creating the exception object, the method handovers the object to the JVM. Whichever method creates the exception object, that particular method handovers the exception object to the JVM. Then JVM will check whether the method contains any exception handling code or not in that particular method. If the method does not contain any exception handling code, then JVM terminates that method abnormally and removes the corresponding entry from the stack. Okay. If that particular method does not contain any exception handling code, then obviously JVM will terminate that particular method and removes that particular entry from the stack. Then JVM identifies its caller method and checks whether the caller method contains any exception handling code or not. So this method in turn might have called from other method, right? So JVM intends to identify that caller method and checks whether any exception handling code is available or not in that caller method. Okay. If the caller method does not contain exception handling code, then JVM terminates that caller method also abnormally and removes the corresponding entry from the stack. Even if the caller method does not contain any exception handling code, JVM terminates that particular caller method even and removes the corresponding entry from the stack. This process will be continued until main method, and if main method also does not contain any exception handling code, then JVM even terminates the main method abnormally and removes the corresponding entry from the stack. Then JVM handovers the responsibility of the exception handling to the default exception handler, which is the part of the JVM. Default exception handler is a part of the JVM. If the JVM tries to find out any exception handling code in any of the methods, and if still it is not able to find any exception handling code in the program, then JVM initiates the default exception handler, which is present in the JVM itself, which is a part of the JVM itself. So default exception handler just prints the exception information in the following format and terminates the program abnormally. Exception in thread so and so, name of the exception, description of the exception, and along with the stack test. I'll take an example to make you understand in a better way. Consider this example: class test, public static void main, string args. This main method is calling a method called doSum. Public static doSum is calling another method called doMoreSum. In the doMoreSum, we have an exception, divide by 0, right? So let us understand this in detail diagrammatically. What happens internally, how a default exception handler get triggered, and how it will display the message in the system console. So in the given program, we have an exception raised in the doMoreSum, right? We are having a divide by 0. 10 by 0 is an error, right? So here we are getting an exception in the method doMoreSum. So what will happen initially, for the main thread, this particular stack will be created, right? Initially the main method will be performed, runtime stack mechanism. You might have followed my previous video. If you have followed that runtime stack mechanism, you will understand how this stack is created. Okay, so the main will be entered first, then do some method will be entered, then do more some method will be entered. So coming from here, in this method we got an exception. So in this method do more sum, there is an exception. So this method is responsible to create an exception object, right? That's what we have discussed, right? Inside a method, if any exception occurs, that method in which it is raised is responsible to create exception object. Okay, so here do more sum is responsible to create the exception object. So what happens is do more sum method will create an exception object. Then what will happen after creating the exception object? This method handovers the exception object to JVM. So do more sum will be creating an exception object and hands it over to the JVM. Thirdly, JVM checks for the exception handling code in do more sum method. There is no handling code, right? There is no handling code. There is no try catch or anything stuff like that handling the exception, right? So JVM terminates do more sum method abnormally and removes from the stack. Because there is no exception handling code for this exception in this particular method, what JVM does is JVM terminates this method do more sum abnormally and removes the entry from the stack. So the stack would become like this. Then who is the caller method of do more sum? Do more sum's caller method is do sum. So JVM identifies its caller method, do sum method, checks for handling code in it. If no handling code found, then obviously JVM terminates do sum abnormally and removes from the stack, right? What a JVM tries to see is there is no exception handling code found in the do more sum method. Tries to see in the its parents method, its callers method. Is there any exception handling code found in this method? If there is, if we don't, if JVM does not find any exception handling code in its caller method, JVM terminates its caller method even abnormally and removes from the stack. So this do sum method also will be removed from the stack. Then JVM again in turn identifies this method's caller method. This method's caller method is main method. It sees whether in this method is there any exception handling code. No, not there, right? Nothing found handling any exception in this method, right? So JVM terminates the main method abnormally and removes from the stack. This time what it does is there is no other caller method, right? This time JVM hands over responsibility to the default exception handler. So then default exception handler comes into the picture and it will print the stack trace like this. Exception in thread main java.lang.arithmetic exception divide by 0 at so and so method at the line number and so method and so method. This is how the default exception gets triggered. Our output would be like this, right? So the syntax like the stack trace would be exception in thread xyz, name of the exception, description, and the stack trace. Let us see with an example. I've written the code already, the same method, same code. Public static void main do sum. I have commented the statement. Public static void do sum. Do sum in turn calls do more sum method. I've taken an exception divide by 0. Let's execute this program. See, we got an exception like this. Exception in thread main java.lang.arithmetic exception divide by 0 at test do more sum, test do sum at test main, right? Let us modify this program and see the output. Let us remove the exception from do more sum and keep that exception in the do sum method. Okay, now let's see the output. I didn't save it. Let me see. See, we can see the output more, right? Here we can see the output more because there's no exception in this more do more sum method, right? So obviously till here there is a normal flow. Till here there is a normal flow. After completion of the this method, it will go back and see for the next line. Here we got an exception, right? That's why in the output we didn't get do more sum method in the stack trace. Now let's change the program. Let's comment it out. Let's keep the exception in the main method. So do sum, there's no exception. Do more sum, there's no exception. Only in the main method we have an exception. We are just printing system.out.println and sum in do sum method. Do more sum, we are printing more. Let's execute this one. See, you can see more first, then sum, and we got an exception at the main method. So this is how default exception works. This is all about default exception handling. Thank you guys.